December 6, 1942. 8,000 feet above Bizerte, Tunisia, the morning sun glinted off the Mediterranean as Lieutenant Werner Schroer rolled his Messerschmitt Bf-109G into a shallow dive. Below him, 3 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings flew in loose formation, their distinctive twin booms unmistakable even at this distance. Schroer had 53 confirmed victories. He understood angles, closure rates, and the mathematics of aerial combat as intimately as he understood his own aircraft. The engagement geometry was perfect. He would dive from the Lightning's 7 o'clock high position, building speed to 400 miles per hour, close to 300 yards, and fire a 2-second burst from his 20mm cannons and twin 13mm machine guns, then pull up and away before the American pilots could react. Standard tactics, the same approach that had destroyed British Hurricanes and Soviet Yaks. Schroer pushed his stick forward and committed to the attack. At 400 yards, he centered his reflector sight on the trailing P-38's left engine nacelle. At 300 yards, he pressed the trigger. His weapons thundered. Bright tracer rounds lanced downward. Then something impossible happened. The P-38 pilot, who by all rights should not have seen Schroer's diving attack from behind and above, somehow knew he was there. The Lightning rolled hard left and pitched up in a climbing turn that seemed to violate the laws of physics for an aircraft weighing over 15,000 pounds. But that maneuver, aggressive as it was, wasn't what made Schroer's blood turn cold. What terrified him was the muzzle flash he saw from the P-38's nose before it even completed its turn. A flash that meant the American pilot had opened fire at a range Schroer's training told him was absurdly beyond effective gunnery distance. He was 1,200 yards from that Lightning. No pilot could hit a target at 1,200 yards. The bullet drop alone made it impossible. Schroer pulled hard, loading his Bf-109 with 6 Gs, seeking separation from what his experience told him was a hopeless long-range shot. Then his instrument panel exploded. A 20mm high-explosive shell had punched through his aircraft's belly, detonated inside the cockpit, and sent shrapnel through every critical system. His engine began hemorrhaging coolant. Black smoke poured from the cowling. Schroer had 7 seconds to decide whether to bail out over enemy territory or try to coax his dying fighter back to German lines. He chose to stay with the aircraft. Nursing the faltering engine, he managed to glide across the front lines and crash land in a dried riverbed 6 miles behind German positions. He walked away with minor injuries, but he never forgot that December morning. He had been shot down from 1,200 yards by a weapon he did not know existed, fired from an angle he had assumed was safe, by a pilot who should not have been able to lead him accurately at such range. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Werner Schroer's experience that December morning represented the beginning of a deadly education for Luftwaffe fighter pilots. The P-38 Lightning they had dismissed as a lumbering twin-engine reconnaissance platform mounted a weapons system unlike anything in European skies, and German intelligence had catastrophically underestimated its capabilities. The centerpiece of this weapon system was the Hispano-Suiza HS 420mm automatic cannon, manufactured under license in the United States as the AN-M2. Unlike the 13mm machine guns or even the 20mm MG-151 cannons mounted in German fighters, which fired relatively low-velocity rounds optimized for close-range dogfighting, the Hispano cannon fired high-velocity projectiles at 2,880 feet per second. This seemingly modest increase in muzzle velocity, approximately 15% faster than German 20mm rounds, created tactical advantages that multiplied exponentially at long range. At 600 yards, a German MG-151 round would drop approximately 18 feet due to gravity, requiring the pilot to aim well above his target. The Hispano round, traveling faster, would drop only 12 feet at the same distance. This flatter trajectory meant P-38 pilots could engage targets accurately at ranges where German pilots were still calculating lead angles. But velocity was only part of the story. The AN-M2 cannon fired high-explosive incendiary rounds weighing 4.5 ounces each. When these shells detonated on impact, they released enough explosive force to tear structural members, ignite fuel tanks, and destroy control systems with a single hit. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, which could absorb multiple hits from 50 caliber machine gun rounds, could be brought down by 2 or 3 20mm Hispano shells, finding critical components. The P-38's weapons installation amplified these advantages through pure geometry. Every P-38 Lightning carried 4 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns and 1 AN M2 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose of the aircraft's central nacelle. The 4 machine guns were positioned in a tight cluster around the cannon. Unlike wing-mounted guns on conventional fighters, which required careful harmonization to converge at a specific range, typically 300 yards, the P-38's nose-mounted weapons converged naturally. Every round from every weapon pointed exactly where the pilot aimed, at any range. This meant a P-38 pilot could open fire at 800 yards, 900 yards, even 1,200 yards, and every bullet, every shell, would fly along parallel paths toward the target. There was no convergence distance to calculate, no sweet spot, where all guns overlapped. The cone of fire remained deadly from point-blank range to the maximum effective distance the guns could reach. Captain James Morris, a P-38 pilot with the 1st Fighter Group, described the advantage in his combat diary entry from January 19, 1943. Fired at a 109 from approximately 700 yards, saw strikes on his right wing route. He rolled over and went in. In a P-40 or P-51, I would never have attempted that shot. The harmonization would have been all wrong, but in the Lightning, where you point is where you hit, regardless of range. The mathematics of this engagement envelope created a tactical revolution. A German pilot in a Bf-109 or Focke-Wulf 190, understanding that his wing-mounted weapons were only reliably effective between 200 and 400 yards, would begin his firing pass at 400 yards and attempt to close to point-blank range for maximum effect. This meant he spent approximately 2 to 3 seconds in a position where he could effectively engage his target. A P-38 pilot, by contrast, could open fire at 800 to 1,000 yards and maintain effective fire all the way to point-blank range. He spent 10 to 12 seconds in a position where every trigger pull could destroy his opponent. 10 to 12 seconds. That disparity meant the Lightning pilot had 4 times as long to achieve a killing shot, and if the German pilot was diving from above, building speed towards 600 miles per hour in his attack run, those 12 seconds represented the difference between life and death. The Luftwaffe's intelligence apparatus had failed to grasp this reality for a simple reason. They had no comparable weapons system. German 20mm cannons, whether the MG-151 or the later MG-151-20, were designed for close-range combat, where German pilots could exploit superior maneuverability. The idea of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 600 yards seemed wasteful of ammunition and unlikely to produce hits. Major Adolf Galland, reviewing intelligence reports about the P-38 inches late 1942, noted the aircraft's armament but assessed it as tactically irrelevant. In his estimation, nose-mounted weapons would be difficult for pilots to aim properly since they sat so far forward of the pilot's natural sight line. Furthermore, Galland assumed American pilots would lack the marksmanship training to hit targets at extended range. Both assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. American P-38 pilots were indeed trained extensively in long-range gunnery. The Army Air Forces had studied Royal Air Force combat reports from the Battle of Britain and understood that deflection shooting, leading targets to account for relative motion, was the critical skill, separating successful fighter pilots from dead ones. Training programs at bases in Arizona and California incorporated high-speed gunnery ranges where student pilots fired at targets moving at 300 miles per hour while they themselves maneuvered at combat speeds. The P-38's gun sight, originally a simple reflector sight with a fixed reticle, evolved rapidly based on combat feedback. By mid-1943, many Lightnings carried the N9 computing gun sight, which used a mechanical system to calculate deflection based on target wingspan and range. A pilot would place the reticle's ranging bars on his target's wingtips, then track the target smoothly. The sight automatically calculated the lead angle needed, adjusting the reticle position to show where the pilot should fire. This combination of nose-mounted weapons, flat trajectory 20mm cannon rounds, and computing gun sights created a weapons system optimized for exactly the kind of combat that developed over North Africa and Europe. German fighters diving through American bomber formations at high speed suddenly found themselves under accurate fire from ranges they had considered safe. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Oberleutnant Heinz Noack, a Luftwaffe ace with 33 confirmed victories, recorded an encounter with P-38 seconds on February 14, 1943, in his war diary. Attacked a Lightning from astern and above, standard approach. Opened fire at 300 meters. The American pilot broke right and climbed. I followed, assuming I had the advantage in a climbing fight. Then I saw tracers coming from his nose. He was firing at me at a range I judged to be 600 meters, perhaps more. 2 shells struck my left wing. I broke off immediately and dove away. Had he hit my engine instead of the wing, I would not have made it home. Noack's experience became increasingly common throughout the early 1943. German pilots who had learned to fear the P-38's speed and twin-engine redundancy now had to contend with a weapon system that could engage them before they entered their own effective firing range. The tactical equation shifted decisively. A German fighter pilot planning an attack on a P-38 faced a brutal calculation. If he attacked from astern, the Lightning pilot could see him coming, turn into the attack, and open fire from 800 yards or more. The German pilot then had approximately 12 seconds, the time it took to close from 800 yards to point-blank range at typical combat speeds, during which he was under continuous accurate fire. If even one 20mm shell found a critical component, his aircraft would be crippled or destroyed. If he attacked from head-on, thinking to exploit the brief window when both aircraft rushed toward each other at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour, he faced the most lethal scenario imaginable. The P-38's nose-mounted cannon and 4 machine guns created a cone of fire directly along the aircraft's axis. Every round traveled along the pilot's line of sight. In a head-on engagement, a P-38 pilot simply pointed his aircraft at the target and fired. There was no deflection to calculate, no convergence issues to worry about. The German pilot, by contrast, had to calculate deflection for his wing-mounted weapons, account for convergence, distance, and deal with the fact that his guns were pointing slightly inward to converge at 300 yards. If he opened fire at 600 yards, his rounds would spread harmlessly wide of the Lightning's nose. If he waited until 300 yards to ensure proper convergence, the P-38 pilot had already been firing accurately for 3 full seconds, sending approximately 40-50 caliber rounds and 10 20mm shells directly at the German fighter's engine and cockpit. German fighter pilots quickly developed an iron rule: never engage a P-38 head-on. The dictum spread through Luftwaffe fighter units in North Africa during early 1943 and reached units in Europe by summer. Training documents from Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter wings, specifically warned pilots that head-on attacks against P-38 seconds were suicidal. But avoiding head-on engagement meant accepting that the Lightning pilot controlled the geometry of combat. If a German pilot refused to close head-on, the P-38 pilot could simply fly at him, forcing the German to break off and maneuver, which surrendered initiative and energy. If the German pilot tried to attack from any angle that wasn't directly astern, the P-38's superior roll rate at high speeds allowed it to turn and bring its nose-mounted weapons to bear quickly. The tactical dilemma had no clean solution. German pilots who survived encounters with P-38 seconds did so by exploiting the Lightning's few weaknesses. The aircraft's roll rate was initially sluggish in the first 10 degrees of bank due to control system rigging. A German pilot under attack could flick roll his Bf-109, exploiting its superior instantaneous roll rate, and dive in the way before the P-38 could track him. But this tactic required perfect timing and positioning. If the P-38 pilot anticipated the maneuver, he could fire into the space where the German fighter was about to roll, and the diving German would fly directly into a stream of 20mm shells. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, commanding officer of the Gruppe, Jagdgeschwader 77, became one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced tacticians, fighting P-38 seconds over the Mediterranean. Between December 1942 and September 1943, his unit engaged Lightning formations dozens of times. Steinhoff personally shot down 4 P-38 seconds, but he lost 12 pilots killed or missing during the same period, many to the Lightning's long-range cannon fire. In a tactical assessment written in July 1943 for Luftwaffe Training Command, Steinhoff detailed what he had learned through bitter experience. He noted that the P-38's weapons gave it an effective engagement envelope, beginning at approximately 700 meters, roughly 760 yards. A skilled P-38 pilot could score hits out to 1,000 meters, over 1,000 yards, though accuracy at that range depended heavily on pilot skill and favorable deflection angles. Steinhoff's report emphasized that German pilots must never allow themselves to be caught in the killing zone between 300 and 700 meters from a P-38 that had achieved a firing position. In this range band, the Lightning's weapons were absolutely lethal. The 20mm cannons struck with enough force to destroy any single-engine fighter with 1 to 3 hits, while the 50-caliber machine guns raked the target with 4 separate streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The mathematics Steinhoff outlined were sobering. A P-38 pilot who acquired a target at 700 meters and held that target in his gun sight while closing to 300 meters had approximately 8 seconds of pilot continuous firing opportunity. The AN-M2 cannon cycled at 700 rounds per minute, roughly 12 rounds per second. In an 8-second engagement, the cannon would fire 96 rounds. The 450 caliber Brownings together cycled at 3,000 rounds per minute, 50 rounds per second. In 8 seconds, they would fire 400 rounds. Of course, no pilot would hold his trigger down for 8 continuous seconds. That would overheat the weapons and waste ammunition. But even a disciplined pilot firing in 1-second bursts would send 12 20mm shells and 50 machine gun rounds toward his target during each trigger pull. 3 such bursts during an 8-second engagement meant 36 cannon shells and 150 heavy machine gun rounds. The sheer volume of fire made evasion extraordinarily difficult. Oberfeldwebel Franz Stiegler, who would survive the war with 28 confirmed victories, encountered this firepower on March 22, 1943 over the Mediterranean. Stiegler had spotted a formation of P-38 seconds, escorting B-25 Mitchell bombers, and maneuvered his Bf-109 into position for a stern attack on a trailing Lightning. He opened fire at what he estimated was 350 meters, saw his rounds strike the P-38's right engine nacelle, and prepared to close for the kill. The Lightning pilot, rather than attempting to evade, pulled into a hard climbing turn to the left, a maneuver that should have bled energy and made him vulnerable. Stiegler followed, confident he could stay with the turn and finish the job. Then he saw muzzle flashes from Lightning's nose. The American pilot had rolled inverted at the top of his climbing turn and was firing at Stiegler while flying upside down, using the superior power of his twin engines to maintain airspeed in a maneuver that would have stalled a single-engine fighter. Stiegler later estimated the range at 500 meters when the first 20mm shells struck his aircraft. One shell exploded in his left wing root, destroying the main spar. Another detonated against his engine's supercharger housing, sending shrapnel through the cooling system. Stiegler had perhaps 20 seconds before his engine seized. He rolled away from the fight, dove towards sea level, and managed to nurse his crippled fighter to a forced landing on a beach near Trapani, Sicily. In his combat report, Stiegler noted that the P-38 pilot had fired at him while inverted in a climbing turn, at a range Stiegler had considered beyond accurate shooting distance. Yet the American had achieved multiple hits in what Stiegler estimated was a 2-second burst. This level of marksmanship, combined with the Lightning's weapon system, created a combination German pilots found increasingly difficult to counter. The technological advantage the P-38's weapons represented was not accidental. It emerged from a specific design philosophy developed by the Army Air Corps in the late 1930s. When Lockheed's design team, led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, began work on what would become the P-38, they made a fundamental decision that would define the aircraft's combat effectiveness. Traditional fighter design placed weapons in the wings because mounting them in the fuselage created complex engineering challenges. Wing-mounted guns were simpler to install, easier to reload, and kept weight distributed along the wingspan where it didn't interfere with center of gravity calculations. But wing-mounted guns suffered from a critical limitation. They had to be angled inward to converge at a specific range, typically 300 yards, where their fire overlapped to create maximum damage. Johnson's twin-boom design freed him from this constraint. With the pilot sitting in a central nacelle and no propeller hub in the way, all weapons could be mounted in the nose, pointing straight ahead. This arrangement meant every gun, naturally, converged with every other gun at all ranges. A pilot aiming at a target 600 yards away would see all his weapons hit within inches of each other. The same was true at 300 yards, 800 yards, or any other distance. The Army Air Corps specification that led to the P-38 specifically called for nose-mounted armament, but it didn't specify what weapons should be installed. Early mock-ups showed various combinations. One proposal mounted two .50 caliber machine guns and one 37mm cannon. Another used six .50 caliber guns with no cannon at all. The final decision to use four .50 caliber Brownings plus one 20mm Hispano cannon came from combat analysis of the Spanish Civil War and early World War II engagements. Army Air Corps observers studying the war in Spain noted that aircraft were becoming more rugged. Stressed metal skins, self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection meant that fighters could absorb more punishment than in World War I. Machine guns alone often failed to achieve kills quickly enough. Pilots would pump hundreds of rounds into targets that simply refused to go down. What was needed was a weapon that delivered not just kinetic impact, but explosive force. The 20mm cannon filled this requirement. A high-explosive 20mm shell detonating inside an aircraft structure did not just puncture skin and damage components. It released overpressure that could blow panels off, shear control cables, and fragment into shrapnel that destroyed everything within several feet of the impact point. One well-placed 20mm hit could do what 50 machine gun rounds might fail to accomplish. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Hispano-Suiza cannon selected for the P-38 had been designed in France in the early 1930s by Swiss engineer Marc Berkicht. It used a combination of blowback and gas operation to achieve a high rate of fire with relatively light weight. The French manufactured it as the Hispano-Suiza HS-404. The British licensed the design and began producing it for their Spitfire and Hurricane fighters. The United States acquired license rights in 1940 and began manufacturing it as the ANM-2. Early production was plagued with reliability issues. The cannon jammed frequently, suffered from ammunition feed problems, and had a tendency to cook off rounds when overheated. American engineers at Colt's Patent Firearms worked through 1941 and 42 to refine the design. By the time P-38 seconds reached operational units in mid-1942, most of the serious problems had been resolved, though the cannon remained more temperamental than the robust Browning machine guns. P-38 pilots learned to treat their 20mm cannon with respect. Staff Sergeant Rex Barber, who would achieve fame for shooting down Admiral Yamamoto's transport in April 1943, noted in a letter home that the cannon was touchy but deadly when it works. Pilots were trained to fire their machine guns and cannon together, using the machine gun's tracer rounds to walk their fire onto the target, with the cannon providing the killing blow. The ammunition load for the P-38's nose-mounted weapons reflected the different roles each weapon played. The four Browning M2 machine guns each carried 500 rounds, for a total of 2,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. At a combined rate of fire of 3,000 rounds per minute, this gave the pilot approximately 40 seconds of continuous machine gun fire, though in practice pilots fired in short bursts to maintain accuracy and avoid overheating. The AN-type M2 cannon carried 150 rounds of 20mm ammunition. At 700 rounds per minute, this translated to roughly 13 seconds of continuous fire. Again, practical combat usage meant firing in bursts, so a typical engagement might consume anywhere from 10 to 30 cannon rounds, depending on target behavior and range. This ammunition capacity meant a P-38 pilot had enough firepower for multiple engagements before needing to return to base. A typical bomber escort mission might involve 3 or 4 separate engagements with German fighters. A pilot who managed his ammunition carefully could remain effective throughout the mission, providing cover for the bombers he was assigned to protect. The tactical implications of this endurance were significant. German fighter pilots attacking American bomber formations knew that P-38 escorts could engage multiple targets without exhausting their ammunition. A German pilot who survived the first pass against a lightning formation could not assume the American fighters were now defenseless. They still had plenty of ammunition and could continue engaging for the rest of the mission. By contrast, German fighters armed with 20mm or even 30mm cannons carried far less ammunition. ABF 109G6, mounting the 30mm Mk108 cannon, carried only 60 rounds. At 650 rounds per minute, that gave the pilot approximately 5.5 seconds of firing time. In practice, this meant 2 or 3 bursts before the weapon was empty. German pilots armed with heavy cannons had to make every shot count. They could not afford to fire speculative bursts at long range. This disparity in ammunition capacity reinforced the P-38's advantage in engagement duration. A German pilot attempting to attack bombers while fending off P-38 escorts had to close to within 300 yards of his target, fire a precise burst, and disengage before the escorts could engage him. He had perhaps 5 seconds of effective firing time before his heavy weapons ran dry. The P-38 pilot escorting those bombers could fire continuously for 13 seconds with his cannon alone, engaging the German fighter at ranges where the Germans' wing-mounted weapons were ineffective. The cumulative effect of these advantages, flat trajectory, nose-mounted installation, long engagement range, and substantial ammunition capacity, transformed aerial combat over Europe. German fighter pilots, who had entered the war with a tactical doctrine based on close-range dogfighting, found themselves facing an opponent who could dictate the terms of engagement from beyond their effective firing range. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, whose earlier encounter with P-38 long-range fire had shocked him, noted in his diary entry for April 9, 1943, that Luftwaffe tactical doctrine was failing against the Lightning. We are trained to close to point-blank range and deliver a killing burst. Against the P-38, this approach is suicide. They begin firing at 600 meters or more, and their shells are accurate at that range. By the time we close to 300 meters, where our weapons are most effective, we have already been under fire for 8 or 10 seconds. Many of our pilots never survive that long. The Luftwaffe attempted to counter the P-38's weapons advantage through several approaches. The first was tactical. Fighter units developed specialized attack profiles designed to minimize exposure to the Lightning's nose-mounted guns. One technique involved high-speed diving attacks from directly astern, exploiting the P-38's relatively poor rearward visibility and slow initial roll rate to achieve surprise. A Bf-109 diving from 25,000 feet to 15,000 feet could reach speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. At that speed, the German pilot could close from 1,000 yards to 300 yards in approximately 4 seconds, barely enough time for the P-38 pilot to react. If the Lightning pilot didn't spot the attack until the German was within 500 yards, he had less than 2 seconds to maneuver before the German reached effective firing range. This tactic worked, but it required perfect execution and favorable initial positioning. The German pilot had to begin his dive from well above and behind the P-38 formation, achieve surprise, execute his firing pass in a near-vertical dive, and pull out at high speed before other P-38 seconds could engage him. It was exhausting, dangerous, and could only be attempted when the tactical situation provided the necessary altitude advantage. A second approach involved using aircraft with superior high-altitude performance. The Bf-109G6 with boosted engine ratings could outclimb the P-38 above 25,000 feet. German pilots learned to engage Lightning formations from above, using altitude advantage to control the geometry of combat. If a P-38 pilot climbed to engage, he surrendered energy and became vulnerable to diving attacks from other German fighters. But this approach had limitations. It required favorable initial conditions and assumed German fighters could achieve altitude advantage before the engagement began. Over the vast bomber streams attacking Germany in 1943 and 44, P-38 seconds often operated at altitudes where their turbocharged Allison engines performed well, negating the German altitude advantage. The third approach was technological. The Luftwaffe began developing and deploying weapons with longer effective range. The Mk108 30mm cannon, while short-ranged due to its low muzzle velocity, delivered explosive shells weighing 330 grams, more than 7 times heavier than the 20mm Hispano round. A single Mk108 hit could destroy a fighter or cripple a bomber. The weapon's short range forced German pilots to close to within 250 yards, well inside the P-38's effective envelope, but the payoff was near certain kills when hits were achieved. More promising was the development of air-to-air rockets. The Werfer 21 rocket, a 21-centimeter unguided projectile weighing over 250 pounds, could be fired from outside defensive gun range at bomber formations. While inaccurate, the massive warhead could destroy a bomber with a near miss. Some German fighters were equipped with these weapons by late 1943, but these technological responses arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to change the strategic balance. By mid-1944, when improved German weapons began reaching operational units in significant quantities, Allied numerical superiority was overwhelming. The Luftwaffe faced not just superior weapon systems like the P-38's nose-mounted cannon, but also a flood of Allied fighters that outnumbered German defenders by factors of 3 to 1 or more. The individual pilot experiences accumulated into a broader statistical reality. Analysis of combat reports from the Mediterranean theater during the first 6 months of 1943 showed that P-38 seconds engaged German fighters at an average range of 550 yards, significantly longer than the 300-yard average for P-51 seconds and P-47 seconds, with wing-mounted weapons. This longer engagement range correlated with higher survival rates for P-38 pilots and higher loss rates for German fighters engaging them. 8th Air Force combat analysis from the second half of 1943 revealed similar patterns. P-38 pilots claimed an average of 2.3 hits per engagement, compared to 1.7 hits for P-47 pilots and 1.9 for P-51 pilots. The difference stemmed primarily from the P-38's lack of convergence issues. Every burst landed where aimed, at any range, while pilots with wing-mounted guns had to account for convergence distance when calculating their aim point. Perhaps more significantly, P-38 pilots reported firing at ranges exceeding 600 yards in 23% of engagements, compared to just 9% for P-47 pilots and 11% for P-51 pilots. This suggested P-38 pilots were confident in their weapons' effectiveness at extended range, while pilots flying other types restricted themselves to closer ranges where wing-gun convergence was more predictable. The German response to these statistics appeared in tactical directives issued throughout 1943 and early 1944. A directive from Jagdfliegerführer 3, responsible for air defense of southern Germany, dated November 19, 1943, stated explicitly that P-38 seconds should be engaged only under favorable conditions and that pilots should disengage immediately if they came under fire at ranges exceeding 400 meters. This directive essentially conceded the P-38's advantage in standoff engagement capability. German pilots were being instructed to avoid exactly the kind of medium-range combat where the Lightning's weapons were most effective. But avoiding such combat meant surrendering initiative and allowing P-38 escorts to protect bomber formations unmolested. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was measurable. Post-war interviews conducted by U.S. strategic bombing survey teams revealed that Luftwaffe pilots consistently rated the P-38 as more dangerous than the P-47 Thunderbolt in the Mediterranean theater, despite the P-47's heavier machine gun armament of .850 caliber Brownings. When asked why, pilots consistently mentioned the P-38's longer effective range and the devastating impact of its 20mm cannon. Hauptmann Heinz Baer, who scored 16 of his 220 confirmed victories against P-38 seconds, stated in a 1947 interview that the Lightning was the most professionally dangerous opponent he faced. Baer explained that while the P-47 had more machine guns and the P-51 had better high-altitude performance, the P-38's combination of long-range cannon fire and twin-engine redundancy made it the most difficult Allied fighter to engage successfully. Baer's assessment reflected a broader truth about weapons' effectiveness in aerial combat. Raw performance specifications mattered less than how those specifications translated into tactical advantage. The P-38's Centerline 20mm cannon, with its flat trajectory and nose-mounted installation, gave its pilots a 12-second window of effective fire starting at ranges beyond 800 yards. Those 12 seconds represented the difference between life and death for hundreds of German pilots who found themselves under accurate fire before they could effectively return it. The legacy of this weapon system extended beyond World War II. Post-war fighter designs almost universally adopted nose-mounted or centerline weapons installations. The F-86 Sabre mounted 650 caliber machine guns in the nose. The F-4 Phantom II, though initially designed without an internal gun, was retrofitted with a centerline M61 Vulcan cannon after combat experience in Vietnam demonstrated the continued importance of guns in air combat. Modern fighters like the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II mount their cannons in the fuselage centerline, maintaining alignment with the pilot's line of sight. The principle the P-38 demonstrated, that weapons which fire along the aircraft's axis of flight provide superior accuracy and extended effective range compared to wing-mounted installations, it became fundamental to fighter design. Every air force that studied World War II combat data reached the same conclusion. Centerline guns worked better than wing guns when technological constraints permitted their installation. For the Luftwaffe pilots who faced P-38 seconds over North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Europe, these design lessons came too late. They had entered combat against an opponent whose weapons could reach out and touch them from ranges they considered safe. The 12 seconds between when a P-38 could open effective fire and when a German pilot could return, that fire proved to be 12 seconds too many for hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters that fell from the sky. Their pilots never understanding until too late that they were already well within their opponent's killing range. The transformation in Luftwaffe tactical thinking regarding the P-38's weapons reached its culmination in early 1944, when German fighter units faced an Allied air armada of unprecedented scale. Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, launched in February 1944 with coordinated attacks on German aircraft production facilities. During 6 days of intense combat between February 20th and February 25th, the 8th and 15th Air Forces dispatched over 3,000 bomber sorties protected by fighter escorts, including hundreds of P-38 Lightnings. Oberst Johannes Trautloft, a veteran fighter leader with 58 confirmed victories, who commanded Jagdgeschwader 54 on the Eastern Front before transferring west, found himself coordinating defensive operations against these massive raids. In his post-war memoir, he described the mathematical impossibility his pilots faced. German fighters attempting to reach the bomber formations had to penetrate screens of escorting fighters that outnumbered them 3 or 4 to 1. The P-38 seconds, operating in the forward escort role, would engage German fighters at ranges exceeding 600 meters, disrupting attack formations before they could reach the bombers. Trautloft noted that his pilots reported being under fire from P-38 cannon at ranges where they could not effectively return fire in approximately 40% of engagements during Big Week. This meant that nearly half the time, German fighters were taking damage before they could even begin their attack runs on the bombers. The tactical situation had become untenable. German fighter pilots were being asked to fight through superior numbers, while accepting casualties from long-range cannon fire before they could engage their primary targets. The loss rates during Big Week reflected this brutal calculus. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 355 fighters destroyed and 203 damaged during those 6 days. Not all losses came from P-38 seconds. Numerous P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds participated in the battles. But post-war analysis of German loss reports and American victory claims suggests P-38 pilots were credited with approximately 68 confirmed kills during Big Week operations. What made these numbers particularly significant was the range at which many engagements occurred. Gun camera footage from P-38 seconds, analyzed after the war, showed that pilots were opening fire at ranges averaging 580 yards during Big Week missions, with some successful engagements occurring at ranges exceeding 800 yards. German pilots interviewed after the war consistently stated they had not expected to come under effective fire at such distances. Lieutenant Walter Krupinski, who survived the war with 197 victories, 97 on the Eastern Front and 100 on the Western Front, described an engagement on February 22, 1944, that exemplified the P-38's long-range advantage. Krupinski had led his staffel of 8 Bf-109 G6 seconds in a diving attack on a formation of B-17 seconds near Gotha. As they approached to within 800 meters of the bombers, preparing to open fire at 500 meters, a flight of 4 P-38 seconds dropped from above and engaged them. Krupinski reported seeing muzzle flashes from the leading Lightning at what he estimated was 700 meters range. He immediately broke right and dove, standard evasive tactics. 3 of his pilots followed. The other 4 continued their attack run toward the bombers. Within 20 seconds, 2 of those 4 were shot down by the P-38 seconds, 1 pilot killed and 1 captured after bailing out. A third Bf-109 suffered major damage to its cooling system and crash-landed behind German lines. The aircraft a total loss. In his combat report, Krupinski noted that the P-38 seconds had achieved 2 confirmed kills and 1 probable from initial firing ranges he judged to be beyond what should have been effective gunnery distance. His surviving pilots reported seeing the 20mm cannon tracer rounds, which burned bright red compared to the orange tracers of 50 caliber rounds, reaching out toward them from distances where they had not expected to be engaged. This pattern repeated across hundreds of engagements during the spring of 1944. German fighter pilots learned through bitter experience that the P-38's effective engagement range exceeded their own by a margin sufficient to give American pilots decisive advantage in most encounters. The Luftwaffe's tactical response evolved into a doctrine of calculated risk management. Fighter units were ordered to engage only when conditions were favorable, altitude advantage, numerical superiority, or tactical surprise. When engaged by P-38 seconds under unfavorable conditions, pilots were instructed to disengage immediately rather than attempting to fight through. This doctrine, while sound from a survival standpoint, meant that P-38 escorts were successfully preventing German fighters from reaching the bomber formations they were assigned to protect. The strategic implications cascaded through the German war economy. Bomber formations protected by fighters that could engage and destroy interceptors at extended range penetrated German air defenses with increasing impunity. Aircraft factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks suffered systematic destruction. By summer 1944, German aircraft production had been severely disrupted despite heroic efforts to disperse manufacturing to underground facilities. Major Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace in history with 352 confirmed victories, all on the Eastern Front, transferred briefly to the Western Front in April 1944 for evaluation purposes. Though primarily experienced against Soviet aircraft, Hartmann flew several missions against American bomber formations and their escorts. His assessment, recorded in Luftwaffe tactical evaluation reports, was stark. Hartmann noted that Soviet fighters, while numerous and increasingly well-flown, generally engaged in close-range turning combat, where German pilots could exploit superior training and aircraft maneuverability. American fighter pilots, particularly those flying P-38 seconds, engaged from extended range using their weapons reach to avoid the knife-fight dogfighting where German experience provided advantage. Hartmann concluded that American tactics exploited technological superiority in a way Soviet tactics did not. This observation highlighted a fundamental difference in how the Allies employed their equipment. Soviet air forces, despite receiving advanced aircraft like the Yak-9 and La-7, continued using tactics that emphasized close-range combat and numerical superiority. American air forces, by contrast, developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the unique advantages their equipment provided. The P-38's nose-mounted weapons gave it superior long-range accuracy, so American pilots were trained to engage at long range. The training infrastructure that produced these skilled P-38 pilots represented a massive investment in human capital that the Luftwaffe could not match by 1944. American fighter pilots destined for P-38 squadrons underwent approximately 210 hours of flight training before reaching operational units. This included extensive gunnery training on ranges where they fired at targets simulating realistic combat conditions. At Luke Field in Arizona and other advanced training bases, student pilots flew P-38 seconds against towed targets moving at speeds up to 300 miles per hour. They practiced deflection shooting, leading moving targets to account for bullet travel time. They learned to estimate range by wingspan appearance and adjust their aim accordingly. Most critically, they practiced firing at extended ranges, where the P-38's nose-mounted weapons provided accuracy that wing-mounted guns could not match. By contrast, German fighter pilot training had been progressively shortened as the Luftwaffe struggled with fuel shortages, instructor losses, and the desperate need for replacement pilots at the front. By mid-1944, German fighter pilots were reaching operational units with as little as 120 hours total flight time, barely half what their American opponents received. Gunnery training suffered particularly. Many German replacement pilots arrived at combat units having fired their weapons only at stationary ground targets. This disparity in training, combined with the P-38's weapons advantages, created a lethal mismatch. Experienced German pilots like Krupinski, Baer, and Steinhoff could exploit the Lightning's weaknesses when conditions permitted. But inexperienced German pilots facing veteran P-38 pilots found themselves under accurate fire before they fully understood they were engaged. The loss rates among German replacement pilots in the first 5 missions were catastrophic, frequently exceeding 50%. Staff Sergeant Arthur Bowers, a P-38 pilot with the 1st Fighter Group who completed his combat tour in July 1944, kept detailed notes of his 52 missions. He recorded 38 separate engagements with German fighters. Of these, he opened fire first in 31 engagements, achieved hits in 23, and was credited with 4 confirmed kills and 3 probables. His average opening fire range, calculated from his own mission notes, was 620 yards. Bowers attributed his success to 2 factors. First, his aircraft's weapons allowed him to fire accurately at ranges where German pilots were not yet prepared to engage. Second, his training had prepared him specifically for long-range deflection shooting. He noted in his diary that he rarely closed to within 300 yards before achieving hits. The combination of flat trajectory 20mm shells and nose-mounted installation meant he could damage or destroy targets while remaining outside the optimal range for their wing-mounted weapons. The final months of the war saw P-38 operations in Europe declining as units transitioned to P-51 Mustangs, which offered superior high-altitude performance and longer range. But in the Pacific Theater, where combat occurred at lower altitudes and the Lightning's twin-engine reliability was valued for flights over vast ocean expanses, the P-38 continued operations until Japan's surrender. The last recorded air-to-air victory by a P-38 in World War II occurred on August 14, 1945, the day before Japan announced its surrender. Captain William Shomo, flying a reconnaissance variant P-38, encountered Japanese fighters over northern Luzon in the Philippines and shot down 2 in a brief engagement. His gun camera footage showed both kills achieved with cannon fire at ranges exceeding 500 yards, a final demonstration of the weapon system that had given German pilots 12 seconds of terror 3 years earlier. Post-war technical intelligence teams that interviewed surviving Luftwaffe pilots and examined German tactical documents found consistent acknowledgement of the P-38's weapons advantage. A 1946 U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey report that compiled these interviews noted that German pilots ranked the P-38's nose-mounted cannon as one of the most effective weapons systems they faced. Multiple pilots mentioned the psychological impact of seeing 20mm cannon tracers reaching toward them from the ranges they had considered safe. The irony was that the technological solution existed in German arsenals. The MG-151, 20 cannon mounted in later Bf-109 and Fw-190 variants, was in many ways comparable to the Hispano cannon. It fired at a similar muzzle velocity, delivered comparable explosive force, and when properly maintained, was reasonably reliable. What German fighters lacked was not the weapon itself, but the installation geometry that made it effective at extended range. German aviation engineers, constrained by conventional design approaches that placed engines in the nose and required wing-mounted weapons, never achieved the clean firing solution the P-38's twin-boom design provided. Some late-war designs, including the jet-powered Me-262, featured nose-mounted cannon, but these arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. The 12 seconds that separated life from death for so many Luftwaffe pilots represented more than just a weapons advantage. It symbolized the broader Allied approach to industrial warfare. American industry produced not just aircraft in vast numbers, but also optimized those aircraft for specific tactical advantages. The P-38's unconventional design, initially ridiculed by German intelligence, proved ideal for mounting weapons that could reach out beyond conventional engagement ranges. German pilots who survived the war and later reflected on their experiences consistently returned to this theme. They had been trained for one kind of aerial combat, close-range dogfighting where skill and experience mattered most. They found themselves facing opponents who fought differently, using technology to engage from beyond conventional ranges, forcing the Germans to either accept casualties while closing to effective range or break off without engaging their targets. Werner Schroer, the pilot shot down from 1,200 yards on that December morning in 1942, survived the war with 114 confirmed victories. In a 1953 interview, he was asked what lessons German pilots should have learned earlier. His response was immediate. "We should have understood that American pilots would fight to their strengths, not ours. Their P-38 could shoot farther than our weapons, so they shot from farther away. It was not complicated. We simply failed to adapt quickly enough." That failure cost the Luftwaffe hundreds of pilots and fighters during the critical years of 1943 and 44. The P-38's Centerline 20mm cannon, firing flat-trajectory high-explosive shells from a nose-mounted installation that provided accuracy at all ranges, gave its pilots a decisive advantage. Those 12 seconds between initial effective firing range and point-blank combat represented 12 seconds where German pilots absorbed fire without being able to effectively return it. In aerial combat, 12 seconds was an eternity. It was time enough for a skilled pilot to line up his shot, compensate for deflection, and send 3 or 4 accurate bursts toward his target. It was time enough for 36 20mm shells and 150 50 caliber rounds to tear through wing roots, engine nacelles, and cockpits. It was time enough to transform the tactical balance of aerial combat over Europe. The Luftwaffe learned this truth through the hardest teacher available: combat against an enemy who understood how to exploit every advantage their weapons provided. By the time German tactical doctrine adapted to counter the P-38's long-range cannon fire, Allied numerical and technological superiority had become overwhelming. The lesson came too late to change outcomes, but it transformed German understanding of what was possible when unconventional design met innovative tactics. Those 12 seconds would echo through aviation history, a reminder that in warfare, the side that best exploits its weapons' unique advantages often prevails regardless of individual pilot skill or courage. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.